Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Tonight's journey is going to take you somewhere dark, bizarre, and slightly blood-soaked. We're diving deep into what it was like to get medical treatment in the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert, if you thought medieval food was bad, just wait till you see what they did with a broken bone or a bad cough. Today, you can walk into a clinic, talk to a licensed professional, and get antibiotics or clean bandages. In the Middle Ages, you might get a knife to the head, a leech to the face, and a priest whispering prayers while you bleed out on a straw mattress. Modern medicine has its flaws, but compared to medieval healthcare, it's basically sorcery. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. You guys make this journey even more amazing. It always fascinates me to see this little history-obsessed corner of the internet connecting people from all over the world. This is what a medieval doctor would do to you, and why it's terrifying. The air is thick with smoke, superstition, and the lingering scent of something unidentifiably rotten. You are not in a world of sterile hospitals or white lab coats. You're in a time where illness isn't just a personal tragedy, it's a community spectacle. Doctors, if you can call them that, are a mix of barbers, astrologers, clergy, and improvising guessers with sharp tools and questionable motives. Medical schools exist, but let's be clear. Most of the training involves watching people die creatively. The top physicians of the day firmly believe that your body is a sack of fluids, and that everything wrong with you is because those fluids, called humors, aren't in harmony. Feeling feverish? That's too much blood. Sad? Definitely an excess of black bile. Got gas? Hope you like enemas. This is a world without germ theory, without anesthesia, and without the faintest clue how the body actually works. You're sick? It must be punishment from God, or bad air, or the moon. There's a genuine belief that sneezing too hard can realign your soul. There's no CPR, but plenty of prayer. Medical care in this world is brutal, inconsistent, and laced with both piety and panic. Hospitals do exist, but they are more like death dormitories. Places run by monks where you're less likely to get better and more likely to be quietly moved to the graveyard in the middle of the night. These places are poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and full of other contagious people wheezing their last. Privacy doesn't exist. Hygiene is a dangerous modern concept. Clean bandages? That's adorable. You're more likely to be wrapped in reused rags soaked with the last patient's pus. Treatments involve bloodletting, purging, cauterization, and herbal remedies that were gathered by someone who probably confused hemlock with parsley. And if you're thinking, well, surely the rich had it better, don't be so sure. Nobles might have private physicians, but those physicians are still using astrology charts to plan surgeries and recommend crushed emeralds to cure seizures. This is the world you live in now. A world where the sick are feared, healing is experimental, and your survival depends less on medicine and more on not needing it. Welcome to the Sick Ages, where catching a cold might get you exercised and recovering from a fever feels like divine intervention. The day begins with your body betraying you. You're not just tired. You're soaked in sweat, your mouth tastes like copper and regret, and your bones feel like they've been rearranged by a blacksmith with a grudge. You try to move, but everything hurts. Deep, marrow-aching pain that makes you wish you'd just stayed asleep. Your skin is flushed, your throat dry, and your chest rattles with every breath like loose stones in a jug. There's no thermometer, no blood pressure monitor. Just your own dread and the hushed whisper of your mother in the next room saying, "Call the healer." Again. You're already terrified, and you haven't even stood up yet. Because in this time, being sick is more than inconvenient. It's a threat to your life, your family, and your reputation. Illness is suspected to be contagious, sinful, or both. If you're too sick, you might be shunned. If the symptoms look serious enough, like, say, a rash or swelling, neighbors might report you, not to help you, but to get your hovel quarantined before the whole village is cursed. And trust me, medieval quarantine doesn't come with snacks or Netflix. It comes with a wooden sign outside your home, a priest muttering scripture, and maybe a bell tied to your neck so people know not to get too close. You stagger to your feet, legs shaking, stomach rolling. Your bed was just straw and old wool, but now it feels like the most merciful place on earth. You vomit bile into a clay bowl, and a relative takes it away. Not to throw it out, but to show it to the healer. Yes, medieval doctors often diagnose based on vomit color, urine scent, and how many times you twitch while sneezing. There's no such thing as a mild flu. You're either getting better or you're dying. No middle ground. Your family gathers in hushed tones, not because they're being respectful, but because they're wondering if they should start carving your name into a wooden cross. You're already being given weak beer to drink because the water could kill you faster than the disease. Someone prays over your feet. Someone else puts a hot cloth on your chest. None of it feels helpful. Everything smells like smoke, sweat, and dread. You've officially become the village's newest medical experiment. You've woken up sick in the Middle Ages, and now the nightmare really begins. There's no search engine to look up your symptoms, no hotline to call, no just rest and hydrate advice from someone with a clipboard. Here in the 1300s, when you get sick, your first, second, and often only diagnosis comes from one of two places: your local healer or your nearest church, and neither of them went to medical school. The village healer might be an old woman with a garden full of herbs and a memory packed with folk remedies. Useful, yes, but also dangerously close to being accused of witchcraft if something goes wrong. The other option? A monk or priest who sees your infection as a test of faith, your fever as divine punishment, and your only hope of survival as prayer and penance. Medicine, as we know it, doesn't exist. The line between science and superstition is as thin as a parchment scroll. Instead of lab results, your future is decided by the tilt of the stars, the smell of your sweat, and whether the town astrologer says Saturn is in a good mood. You're told your humors are out of balance, so maybe it's time to drain your blood or induce vomiting. Maybe your liver is too moist. Maybe your bile is too dry. It doesn't matter that none of these things are real. What matters is that your body is now the battlefield of beliefs, and every treatment comes with a side of theological guilt. You sit on a wooden stool, coughing your lungs out, while a robed man squints into your eyes and sniffs your breath. He mutters something about demons. Then he sprinkles holy water and draws a cross on your forehead. That's not a blessing. That's a preliminary treatment. Because before a doctor cuts you, he has to be sure the devil isn't just nesting behind your eyeballs. This is a time when people believe disease floats through the air like invisible spirits, or worse, that you brought it on yourself through sin. You didn't go to church last Sunday? That sore on your leg might be divine judgment. You had lustful thoughts? That chest pain could be retribution. You're not just sick, you're guilty. And the tools used to treat you? They're relics of the absurd. Astrological charts guide when surgeries should happen. Bloodletting schedules are based on moon phases. Diagnosis is tied to the smell and color of bodily fluids. If you've ever doubted the value of modern medicine, remember this. At one point in history, a patient's fate hinged on whether the priest liked the look of their spit in a bowl of cold water. In the Middle Ages, your doctor and your confessor are often the same man. And his cure? Sometimes a prayer, sometimes a blade, and sometimes nothing at all. You hear the creak of the wooden door and the shuffle of worn leather boots. The town healer has arrived. You'd think this would be a moment of relief, someone to finally help. But in the Middle Ages, when the healer enters your home, hope walks in wearing the same cloak as dread. He's not what you'd expect. No white coat, no clipboard, no reassuring bedside manner. Instead, he's cloaked in wool, stained with smoke, sweat, and possibly someone else's blood. Around his waist hangs a pouch of dried herbs, a dull scalpel, a few metal probes, and a leather-bound book filled with notes that look more like prayers than prescriptions. This is your doctor. He might also double as a barber, an apothecary, or a guy who once watched someone survive a boil lancing and now claims expertise. He doesn't ask about your symptoms with concern. He examines you like a blacksmith inspects a cracked horseshoe. His fingers are rough. His breath smells like garlic and wet wood. He leans in close, peers into your eyes, prods your belly, and makes a few grunting noises before declaring something like excess of yellow bile or the spleen is displeased. You're too scared to ask what that means. Now, the treatment begins, and it's a performance as much as a procedure. He pulls out a leech with theatrical flair and sets it to work on your wrist. He pours bitter liquid down your throat that tastes like ash, mold, and regret. He burns herbs in a cracked clay pot, letting the acrid smoke swirl around your face to drive out the ill spirits. The healer's philosophy is simple. If the body is sick, you must make it suffer to get better. So he cuts, scrapes, pinches, burns, and bleeds you, all in the name of harmony. If you start to shake violently, he nods approvingly. The illness is releasing. If you vomit uncontrollably, that's even better. The humors are balancing. If you lose consciousness, he calmly says, the body is resting. And if you die, he shakes his head solemnly. God's will. There is no malpractice insurance here, no second opinions. The town healer carries the weight of life and death in his stained hands, and never once questions if the knife he's using was properly cleaned since the last patient. Outside, the neighbors whisper. Inside, you sweat and shiver, your body reeling from the raw theater of medieval medicine. The healer hums a chant as he mixes powdered roots into a bowl, pausing occasionally to spit in it for binding energy. This is not science, this is ritual. Pain is part of the cure, and trust, well, that's something you give because you have no other choice. The town healer has arrived, and so begins your first real step into medieval recovery, or something that vaguely resembles it. So, here you are, strapped with leeches, and sipping something that tastes like graveyard soup, and you still don't actually know why this is supposed to help. It all comes down to the cornerstone of medieval medicine, the four humors. No, not comedy, though you might laugh in despair. This theory, inherited from ancient Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, says that your health is dictated by four bodily fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Too much or too little of any one of these, and boom, disease. Blood, that's your vitality. Too much and you're feverish or overly cheerful. Too little and you're pale and slow. Yellow bile is fire and anger. Too much and you're irritable or vomit bile. Black bile is earth and melancholy. Welcome to medieval depression. Phlegm is water and coldness, responsible for sluggishness, coughs, and pretty much anything involving mucus. These humors weren't just physical fluids, they were your personality, your emotions, your destiny. Medieval doctors didn't just treat your symptoms, they balanced your soul's soup. This wasn't medicine, it was a worldview. Every aspect of your being was tied to these humors, and so were your treatments. If you were hot and flushed, bloodletting, melancholic, purge with herbs and a dramatic enema. Coughing too much? You're drowning in phlegm, so get ready to drink something viscous and horrifying. Medieval practitioners kept charts detailing which foods, seasons, and even times of day increased or decreased each humor. Got a cold in winter? That's double phlegm. Better roast in front of a fire and eat hot onions soaked in vinegar. The worst part is how confident they were. Your symptoms weren't an anomaly, they were a predictable cosmic imbalance. A good doctor didn't need to see your organs. He needed to smell your sweat, check your complexion, maybe squint at your poop under candlelight. And if he really wanted to show off, he'd use astrology. Because obviously, if Saturn was aligned wrong when you were born, your spleen might hold a grudge. So when the healer mutters something about dry yellow excess and prescribes both bloodletting and boiled nettles, he's not improvising. He's operating within a system that dominated medicine for over 1,000 years. And the kicker? If it worked, it was divine grace. If it failed, your humors must have been too far gone. Either way, the theory stayed. The only thing that didn't survive, often, was you. You'd think with all the sniffing, poking, and bodily fluid analysis, a medieval doctor might be too busy to check the stars. But no, before that scalpel touches your skin, your physician consults his astrological chart. Because clearly, whether or not your spleen explodes during surgery depends heavily on whether Mars is in Capricorn. In medieval Europe, medicine and astrology weren't just linked, they were married, and not in a healthy way. Every body part was assigned a zodiac sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces, which got stuck with the feet. So if you had a toothache and the moon was in Aries, you better cancel that extraction or risk great peril and uncontrolled bleeding. This wasn't superstition. This was doctrine. Universities taught it. Doctors carried ephemerids, giant almanacs charting the stars, right beside their leech jars and bone saws. Let's say you've got stomach cramps. Before treatment, the healer checks your birth chart. Maybe he finds that Mercury is in opposition with your natal moon. Now that's not indigestion, it's celestial imbalance. The cure? Wait 3 days, pray to St. Elmo and avoid radishes. You're not just a body, you're an astrological puzzle. And don't even think about surgery unless the stars align. Bloodletting, for instance, has its own calendar. Do it on the wrong day and it could cause more bleeding, infection, or, death. Trepanation, the medieval practice of drilling into skulls, was reserved for the right lunar phase. Not because it's safer then, but because it pleases the heavens. In some regions, even basic wound care was avoided if the sky warned against it. You could be lying there with a compound fracture, and your doctor's flipping through charts instead of splints. The logic? If the planets affect tides, surely they affect your innards too. That kind of thinking allowed healers to delay treatment, assign blame to the cosmos, and avoid personal responsibility. Got worse after treatment? Blame Saturn? Died under care? The stars were cruel. In a world where disease was mysterious and medicine often did more harm than good, astrology offered certainty, even if it was utterly wrong. You're flushed, dizzy, and sweating through your one wool tunic. Clearly, something's wrong. And in medieval medicine, the answer is always the same. There's too much blood in your body. The solution? Drain it out. Welcome to bloodletting, the go-to treatment for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Got a fever? Bleed, trouble sleeping? Bleed, lost a limb? You better believe they'll bleed the stump too. In this era, bloodletting isn't just a remedy, it's practically a lifestyle. The process is as crude as it is horrifying. First, the healer selects a vein, maybe in your forearm, neck, or behind your knee, depending on what's ailing you. He may consult a vein map, a woodblock diagram of the human body that looks like it was drawn by someone who's never actually seen one. Then comes the instrument, a sharp lancet, a curved fleam, or, if you're especially unlucky, a rusty knife that's been passed down like a family heirloom. No gloves, no cleaning, just a rag to mop up the mess, and maybe a bowl to catch the gore. Some bloodlettings are gentle, a few ounces at a time. Others, more ambitious. You could lose up to a pint or more, depending on how long you scream or how deep the cut goes. If you faint, the doctor might smile. "It's working," he says, completely unfazed. Meanwhile, your body is going into shock, and you're praying the rats under your bed don't crawl up to say goodbye. And if cutting a vein feels too invasive, don't worry. There's always leech therapy. These little bloodsuckers were prized like medical tools. Doctors kept jars of them, nurtured them like pets, and applied them with precision. You'd lie there while leeches latched onto your temples, ankles, or even more sensitive places. The worst part? They didn't stop when they were full. They stopped when they were bored. And when they did, you bled anyway. Bloodletting didn't just treat real ailments, it was preventative. Feeling too energetic? Better schedule a bleed. Got a big religious holiday coming up? Let's purify your soul with a bit of your life essence. It was routine, ritualistic, and sometimes deadly, but no one questioned it because everyone believed too much blood was dangerous. Ironically, it was the treatment that posed the greatest threat. Medieval doctors weren't just draining illness, they were draining life, one cut at a time. You walk into a barber shop expecting a shave, maybe a haircut, and instead you're getting a tooth pulled, a wound cauterized, or your skull drilled open. Why? Because in medieval Europe, barbers didn't just handle hair, they were also surgeons, dentists, and bone setters. That red and white striped pole outside? It's not decoration, it's a symbol of blood and bandages. Welcome to the world of the barber surgeon, the man who can trim your beard and remove your appendix in the same sitting. Formal medical education was rare, expensive, and largely theoretical. Actual surgical work was considered beneath the real physicians, who preferred writing prescriptions and discussing humors in Latin. So, surgery, messy, physical, dangerous, fell to barbers. And let's be honest, the tools of the trade weren't all that different. Scissors, razors, pliers, anything sharp enough to cut hair could also cut skin. And if it couldn't, well, there's always a branding iron to finish the job. You sit in a chair that smells like blood, smoke, and burnt cloth. There's no anesthesia, just a leather strap to bite down on and a prayer whispered under your breath. Need a boil lanced? The barber heats a knife until it glows orange. Dislocated shoulder? He'll pop it back with a move that feels more like torture than treatment. Toothache? The barber pulls it out with pliers, no matter how deep the root goes. Bleeding? He's got you covered, literally, with a mixture of moldy bread and cobwebs. Barber surgeons didn't just work in towns, they followed armies, treating battlefield wounds between sword swings. Their skills were practical, brutal, and often life-saving. If you survived the pain and didn't die of infection. They were fast, rough, and had no time for ceremony. If you were lucky, you left their chair stitched up and woozy. If not, someone else cleaned up the blood and started prepping the next patient. Despite their questionable hygiene and multitasking madness, barber surgeons were the closest thing many people had to emergency care. They were accessible, affordable, and willing to work with what little they had. Just don't expect a gentle bedside manner. Because in this time, your barber could kill you faster than your barber could shave you, and that's assuming he's not doing both at once. You're sick, weak, and barely able to sit upright, but your healer isn't worried. In fact, he has the perfect solution squirming around in a glass jar at his side. Leeches. Black, slimy, wriggling little vampires ready to attach themselves to your skin and suck the sickness out, literally. In the medieval world, these creatures were more than just swamp pests. They were prized medical instruments, trusted more than most human hands. The logic was simple and terrifying. Disease comes from imbalanced humors, especially too much blood. Leeches, then, were seen as self-regulating tools of nature. Gentle surgeons who could remove just the right amount without the mess of a blade. Physicians loved them. Apothecaries sold them by the dozen. And nobles, they paid top coin to be bled by the finest leeches imported from the most medically potent swamps. There were entire leech farms across Europe. Yes, people made a living harvesting the worms that fed on you. The process was as unpleasant as you'd expect. The leeches were applied to soft, fleshy areas, the neck, inner thighs, armpits, sometimes even inside the mouth or nostrils. Once attached, they went to work, numbing the bite with a mild anesthetic in their saliva before sucking blood for 20 minutes or more. When they finished, they dropped off bloated and drunk on your life force. And the wound? It kept bleeding for hours thanks to their natural anticoagulant, leaving you dizzy, damp, and covered in linen wrappings that would never be truly clean again. Leeches weren't just used for fevers or headaches. They were slapped onto women to help with hysteria, applied to swollen joints, and sometimes placed directly onto infected wounds in hopes the worm would suck out the rot. Oddly enough, in rare cases, they actually helped. By removing dead tissue or draining infected fluids, leeches accidentally performed rudimentary debridement centuries before doctors understood why it worked. But let's not give them too much credit. They also caused infections, excessive bleeding, and the kind of psychological trauma that sticks with you for life. To the medieval mind, however, leeches were loyal allies. Their movements were mysterious, their appetite unstoppable, and their popularity endless. These tiny beasts became symbols of medicine itself, featured in books, recipes, and medical emblems. If a healer didn't carry leeches, they weren't taken seriously. You didn't need a license to practice medicine, but you did need a jar full of worms ready to do their slimy duty. You have a splitting headache. Maybe you've been having visions. Maybe your ears won't stop ringing. Or perhaps your behavior's changed just enough for someone to whisper, "Possession." The cure? Trepanation. Also known as, "We're going to drill a hole in your skull and see if that helps." And yes, that is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Trepanation is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history, predating even the Middle Ages, but by the 13th and 14th centuries, it had evolved into a favored treatment for head injuries, seizures, insanity, and just about any affliction that didn't respond to leeches. The logic? If something's wrong inside the head, pressure, spirits, demons, you need to let it out. Literally, through a hole, made with a knife, a chisel, or if you're unlucky, a hand-cranked drill that looks more like carpentry equipment than anything meant for a human skull. The patient, usually a peasant, a prisoner, or someone desperate, is held down by relatives or assistants. There is no anesthesia, no numbing. Just the grinding noise of metal against bone and the overwhelming scent of burning flesh if a cautery iron is involved. The procedure takes anywhere from 15 minutes to over an hour, depending on the doctor's experience and whether or not the patient screams themselves unconscious first. And what are they hoping to find inside? Nothing. Trepanation isn't exploratory, it's excretory. The belief is that bad humors, spirits, or pressure will escape through the opening like steam from a boiling pot. Some patients even survived, skulls healing over the years with a circular scar like a grim badge of honor. But survival wasn't guaranteed. Infection, blood loss, or sudden brain exposure to open air often made this a one-way operation. Still, the practice persisted. Clergy approved it if the intent was to rid someone of demonic influence. Surgeons advocated for it in battle injuries to relieve cranial pressure, and desperate families consented. Because in a world where most treatments were slow and uncertain, at least this one looked like action. A hole in the head meant hope, bizarre as it sounds. And if you didn't survive, well, at least your demons died with you. Let's say your skin suddenly erupts in painful boils, oozing blisters or strange black patches. You think it's an infection. Your medieval healer thinks it's corruption, bad blood rising to the surface, or punishment seeping from your pores. And the solution? Fire. Smoke. Maybe a bit of lard. Because in this era, if something swells, the answer is almost always to burn it. Boils were seen not as signs of bacterial infection, but as evidence that your humors were revolting against each other. The more grotesque the swelling, the more urgent the need to purge it, by slicing, squeezing, or cauterizing. There were no antibiotics, no sterile technique, just a hot poker, a rough cloth, and a scream you hoped wouldn't last too long. First, they might lance the boil with a blade that's been used on half the village. If that didn't drain it, they'd pack it with heated animal fat or a poultice made from crushed herbs, dung, and ash. If that still didn't work, or if your healer was feeling particularly theatrical, they'd light a fire, heat a metal rod, and press it to your flesh until the boil retreated, or you passed out. Cauterization was the ultimate fallback. It was used to treat infection, seal wounds, and scare evil spirits away. The sizzling of skin was considered a cleansing process. If you smelled burning, you knew the demons were running. In theory, anyway. In reality, you were often left with seared nerves, open sores, and the high risk of turning a simple boil into a life-threatening infection. But it wasn't just about effectiveness, it was about spectacle. Healers believed the body responded better when shocked. Pain wasn't avoided. It was summoned, weaponized, and justified. Blisters? If they weren't lanced, they might be rubbed with vinegar or scraped off entirely. Skin lesions might be treated with hot wine, burning coals, or salt poured directly onto the flesh. If someone dared suggest that this was too cruel, the response was predictable. It must be done, or they'll rot from within. Because in medieval minds, infection was less about bacteria and more about inner decay manifesting as foul eruptions. Your skin wasn't just damaged, it was confessing. So, what did you do when a boil appeared? You prayed it would go away. Because if your healer got involved, chances were good you'd leave with a scar, a fever, and a story your descendants would whisper for generations. There are few phrases in history that strike dread quite like this. The plague has arrived. It doesn't knock, it doesn't whisper. It crashes through your town like a vengeful god, blackening bodies and emptying homes faster than prayers can be said. You hear about it first in rumors. Someone died across the river. Someone's skin turned purple. Someone coughed and bled at the same time. And suddenly, fear spreads faster than the disease itself. The bubonic plague was the ultimate medieval nightmare. Swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, would erupt under your armpits, neck, and groin, turning black and hot to the touch. Fever, delirium, vomiting, and agonizing pain followed. Sometimes you died in 3 days, sometimes in 1. If you were especially unlucky, you lingered, hallucinating, gasping, and leaking fluid until your body simply gave up. There were no hospitals equipped to handle the flood of sickness. Instead, people were dragged into mass quarantine zones, basically death wards, where they were left to expire surrounded by the moans of others. Priests arrived to offer last rites, but even they began refusing entry. Doctors, if they stayed at all, wore bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges. These weren't just creepy. They were meant to purify the air. But of course, they didn't work. The disease spread anyway, through fleas, rats, coughing, and the simple act of being alive near someone who wasn't going to be much longer. Whole towns shut down. Families locked themselves inside, nailing the doors shut. Streets became graveyards. Bodies were loaded into carts, dumped into mass graves, and covered with lime or burned when they couldn't be buried fast enough. The smell of death was constant, lingering in cloth, in water, in the very wood of your home. It wasn't just a plague. It was a judgment day stretched over months. And the treatments? Absurd. Doctors prescribed crushed emeralds, chicken plasters, and sitting in sewage to balance humors. Some people fled to the countryside, hoping fresh air would save them. Others turned to flagellants, wandering groups who whipped themselves in public, hoping their suffering would end God's wrath. No one knew how it spread. Everyone knew someone who had died. You lived in a time where survival was a coin toss, and the plague carried the dice. You've seen the image, the long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, and that nightmarish bird-like mask. It looks like something out of a horror movie. But in the Middle Ages, this was a real person, your doctor. And when you saw that figure waddling toward your village, it wasn't a sign of hope. It was a sign that death had officially checked in. These were the plague doctors, and yes, they looked exactly as terrifying as they sound. The infamous beaked mask wasn't a fashion choice. It was a misguided attempt at personal protection in a world that had no idea what germs were. The long nose of the mask was stuffed with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, vinegar-soaked cloth, and sometimes camphor or sponges. The idea? To filter out the bad air, or miasma, that people believed caused disease. The herbs were there to ward off the plague. Spoiler, they didn't. But it made the air smell slightly less like death, which probably felt like a win. Plague doctors wore full-length leather or waxed linen gowns, gloves, boots, and that broad-brimmed hat. It was less about medical effectiveness and more about full-body coverage. The staff they carried, that wasn't a cane. It was a tool to prod the sick without touching them, to inspect wounds at a distance, or to poke corpses and make sure they weren't just sleeping. They rarely took off the gear, not because they understood transmission, but because getting too close to the sick was considered flirting with your own funeral. And what did they actually do? They tracked the infected. They documented the dead. They offered what little treatment they could, lancing buboes, prescribing vinegar, or applying dubious poultices. Some conducted bloodletting, others just carried out death counts and wrote grim notes on wax tablets. They were often appointed by towns, not by medical authorities, and many had little or no real medical training. In fact, in some cases, plague doctors were criminals or outcasts given the role in exchange for a pardon. Their presence alone was enough to strike terror. Children were told that if they didn't behave, the beaked man would come. Adults saw them as walking omens, and in many cases they were. By the time a plague doctor arrived, your odds of survival had already dropped. They didn't heal. They marked the boundary between the living and the dead, a literal figure of dread with the stench of fear and rose petals trailing behind them. So, you've been diagnosed, maybe with the plague, maybe just a hot liver, and now it's time for treatment. Not surgery, not antibiotics. No, in this time, you're about to be healed with the power of smoke and a strong belief in airborne curses. Welcome to the herbal chaos of medieval fumigation, where saving your life involves turning your home into a smokehouse and your lungs into spice racks. The core belief behind these remedies is the theory of miasma, the idea that disease spreads through poisonous, corrupted air. And so, to fight that, people turned to smoke and scent. Healers would burn bundles of herbs: rosemary, sage, lavender, juniper, frankincense. Homes were filled with so much smoke you could barely see the walls. Patients coughed, wheezed, and blinked through the haze, all in hopes that the bad air, and the sickness it carried, would be driven out like an unwelcome spirit. The same went for clothing and furniture: capes, tunics, straw bedding, wooden floors. Everything was doused in perfumed vinegar or waved through clouds of burning thyme. People wore nosegays, little bundles of herbs, pinned to their collars or shoved in their sleeves. Doctors held dried flowers under their masks. Some households dangled oranges stuffed with cloves from the rafters like disease-fighting chandeliers. And if smoke wasn't doing the trick, time to escalate. Vinegar baths where the sick were soaked in diluted wine. Onion and garlic poultices pressed to the chest. Floors sprinkled with powdered sulfur or charcoal. In some cases, they even burned dung. Not because it smelled nice, but because it was believed that one foul odor could drive out another. You weren't just fighting illness. You were waging a nasal war. None of this, of course, actually killed bacteria. But in a time with no understanding of infection, people did what they could. And in a twisted way, the rituals brought comfort. Filling the room with scent and smoke made it feel like you were doing something. Anything. Because the truth was too awful to face, that sometimes the illness had already won. All that was left was the illusion of control, and the smell of rosemary clinging to a bed where no one would ever rise again. You're burning up with fever, your body trembling under a mound of lice-infested blankets, and who walks through the door? Not a physician, not a healer, but a priest, rosary in hand, eyes full of solemn mercy. In the Middle Ages, religion and medicine were tangled like vines on a crumbling wall. Illness wasn't just a physical problem, it was a spiritual crisis. And who better to treat a soul in distress than someone trained in the eternal? Monasteries were often the only places that resembled hospitals. They were quiet, candlelit sanctuaries where monks administered care through prayer, fasting, and, on lucky days, rudimentary treatments copied from ancient Greek or Roman texts. These religious caretakers believed that most disease stemmed from sin. Ailments were divine punishments, and healing required penance. If you suffered, it meant God was watching. If you recovered, it meant God forgave. Your treatment might include holy water sprinkled over your body, prayers whispered at your bedside, or long confessions about your thoughts, sins, and spiritual weaknesses. Monks would chant over your fever, anoint you with oil, and advise that you abstain from meat, sex, and laughter. For some, healing was about purification, not just of the body, but the soul. You didn't need ointment, you needed absolution. That said, many monks were well read in what passed for medical knowledge at the time. They preserved manuscripts, tracked symptoms, and cultivated herb gardens with plants used for healing. Mint for the stomach, poppy for pain, sage for inflammation. but they also relied on divine intervention. If you broke a leg, they might bandage it, but they'd also recommend a prayer to Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian. Plague? Pray harder. Childbirth complications? Light a candle for Saint Margaret. Madness? That's a demon, time for exorcism. In truth, monks were often the best caregivers available, gentle, clean, by medieval standards, and at least somewhat organized. But their worldview was limited. They saw disease as part of a moral order, not a biological one. And when things got truly bad, they'd shift from care to preparation. You might be dying, but their focus would turn to your soul's safe passage. You'd be given the last rites, surrounded by incense and Latin, while your fever spiked and the room swam. In the Middle Ages, you didn't just fear death. You feared dying unshriven. And that's why your doctor might be a priest. Not because he could save your body, but because he was your last hope of saving anything at all. You've tried prayers, herbs, smoke, and leeches. Nothing's working. The wound is festering, the swelling won't stop, and your screams are starting to worry the neighbors. There's only one option left: surgery. And, in the 14th century, that means something between carpentry and horror fiction. Welcome to the world of medieval surgery, done in your home by candlelight, using tools that wouldn't be out of place in a torture chamber. There are no sterile gloves, no anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a blade, a bowl for blood, and possibly a friend to hold your limbs down while the healer gets to work. The lighting is dim. Torches or candles, casting flickering shadows across your terrified face. You can hear the steel scraping against wood as the surgeon sharpens his knife. You pray he's sober. He starts by inspecting the area. Infection, fracture, foreign object, doesn't matter. The solution is always the same. Cut it out, burn it closed. If you've got an arrowhead lodged in your thigh, he'll dig it out with iron tongs. If it's a gangrenous finger, it gets chopped off with a cleaver. If it's a stomach wound, well, may God have mercy. Some surgeons used wine to clean wounds, if they could spare it. Others didn't bother. After all, if the bleeding stops, that's a win. You're conscious the entire time. There's no ether, no morphine, maybe a leather strap to bite, maybe a splash of brandy beforehand. You scream, you convulse, and if you pass out, the surgeon works faster. Blood spills onto the floor, pooling in grooves of the wooden boards. Flies gather. Someone in the background is sobbing. Might be you. It's hard to tell. When the cutting ends, the burning begins. Cauterization closes wounds and stops bleeding, or so they believed. A heated iron is pressed directly to the skin. It hisses. It smokes. The smell is unforgettable. Scorched flesh and burning hair. You don't forget it, even if you survive. It haunts you. And yet, this wasn't always a death sentence. Some patients lived. They limped away, missing a part, but breathing. For all its brutality, medieval surgery was sometimes effective, especially in battles, where surgeons got plenty of hands-on experience reattaching jaws or sealing up gashes. They were craftsmen in a world with no safety net, but every operation was a gamble. You didn't get a follow-up appointment. You got a wooden cross and a prayer. You fall. You hear the crack. The pain is instant and unbearable. You've broken a bone, and in the Middle Ages, that's not a trip to the emergency room, it's a sentence. The healer arrives not with a cast or a splint kit, but with something heavier, a saw, maybe a mallet, and a rope to keep you still. Because in this world, a broken limb isn't just inconvenient, it's a crisis that may cost you your life or at least a piece of yourself. If the break is simple, clean and close to the surface, there's a chance they'll try to set it. But setting it involves pulling, twisting and yanking the limb back into alignment with no painkillers, no numbing agents, just raw medieval muscle, and maybe a bottle of something alcoholic to bite between your teeth. You scream, they pull. Someone holds you down, muttering a prayer or pretending not to look. If the bone is sticking out, if there's infection, or if it's too complicated to fix, they don't try to save it. They take it off. Amputation wasn't just a battlefield horror. It was domestic. It happened in kitchens, on church steps, in dusty corners of village huts. The leg is bound above the break to stem the blood flow. The healer says something like, "This will be quick," which is always a lie. Then the saw begins. It's not sharp, it's not fast. It's a grating, agonizing process that turns flesh, tendon, and bone into something unrecognizable. You howl or you faint, or both. And when it's over, they press a burning iron against the stump to stop the bleeding, the flesh sizzling like meat on a spit. If you survive, congratulations. You now get to spend the rest of your life hobbling on a wooden peg, if you're lucky enough to get one. Infection is almost guaranteed. There's no sterile dressing, no antibiotics. Just a rag and a hope that the wound scabs over instead of festering. You'll live in pain, with phantom limb sensations that no one can explain and no one believes. Still, this was the best option they had. A successful amputation might save your life. An untreated compound fracture? That could kill you slowly, from rot, fever, or sepsis. In a world where healing was a matter of speed and brutality, the saw was both weapon and savior. You didn't thank your surgeon. You just nodded while trembling, because you knew you'd never forget the sound of bone being sawn like firewood. Before you get too comfortable mocking medieval doctors with saws and smoke, consider this. Sometimes the only thing standing between you and a miserable death was a patch of herbs, a lucky guess, and someone's great-grandmother's recipe for healing tea. Because in an age before antibiotics, antiseptics, or basic understanding of the immune system, healing came from the earth, and a whole lot of desperate experimentation. Medieval herbalists were the era's pharmacists, though no one used that word. These were wise women, monks, or traveling healers who knew their plants, at least as far as local lore and guesswork would take them. They grew gardens packed with medicinal flora, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, comfrey for broken bones, mint for nausea, nettle for fevers. And it wasn't just what you used, but how you used it. Crushed, boiled, dried, smoked, applied as a poultice, or stuffed in a linen sachet and worn around your neck like a leafy talisman. But for every helpful herb, there were just as many lethal mistakes. Belladonna, hemlock, foxglove, pretty plants that could stop your heart faster than any disease. Dosing was a mystery. Too little, and nothing happened. Too much, and you'd start hallucinating angels moments before your intestines shut down. Healers relied on touch, smell, and intuition, scribbled notes in Latin, and grim trial and error that often left the patient worse off than when they started. And the combinations? They were like a fever dream of desperation. Mugwort mixed with pig fat, honey boiled with ashes, crushed toads in vinegar, or even a paste made from powdered mummy. Yes, actual mummified human remains imported at great cost. You weren't just ingesting medicine. You were gambling with chemistry your doctor didn't understand. Still, herbal remedies were often all people had. They were cheap, accessible, and didn't involve knives or hot metal. They offered hope when nothing else did. And in rare moments, they actually worked. Willow bark did reduce pain. Garlic had antimicrobial properties. Honey prevented infections. The tragedy was that medieval people didn't know why. only that sometimes, after a long enough prayer and the right blend of leaves, someone actually got better. So you drank the tea, you wore the charm, you rubbed the salve and hoped the swelling would go down. Because in this world, herbal medicine wasn't science. It was survival. And every brew was a whispered hope that maybe, just maybe, the weeds would win. You're aching, feverish, and covered in sores. The healer examines your body, nods solemnly, and hands you a small flask. Inside, mercury, liquid metal, poison. But in the Middle Ages, it was considered medicine, miraculous, mysterious, and dangerously misunderstood. Because when all else failed, the answer wasn't caution. It was mercury, for wounds, for ulcers, for rashes, and especially for syphilis before anyone knew what syphilis actually was. Mercury was thought to purge the body of corruption. It was applied topically, injected as an ointment, vaporized and inhaled, or taken orally in small doses. Let that sink in. They inhaled mercury fumes while standing over boiling bowls. They rubbed it into their skin. They swallowed it. The results? Sometimes dramatic improvement of symptoms, but not the disease. Mercury may have slowed infections like syphilis, temporarily easing rashes and pain, but it didn't kill the bacteria. It just poisoned the host slowly enough that people mistook side effects for progress. And oh, the side effects: tremors, ulcers, tooth loss, muscle weakness, psychological collapse, mouths filled with sores, tongues swollen, gums bleeding. The very symptoms mercury was supposed to cure often reappeared, worse, and were blamed on the disease, not the treatment. Some patients literally went mad from prolonged exposure. But since mercury was exotic, expensive, and difficult to obtain, it carried an air of prestige. The wealthy used it more, and as always, their suffering was cloaked in confidence. Mercury wasn't just used in the body. It was mixed into balms, used to polish wounds, and believed to chase out dark spirits. You could sit in a steam tent filled with vaporized mercury, hallucinating as your healer chanted prayers and waved herbs. You might leave the tent thinking you were cured. You'd also leave with your lungs damaged, your skin irritated, and your fate sealed. And yet, it persisted, because desperate times called for desperate alchemy. Today, mercury is a byword for danger, but in the Middle Ages, it was cutting-edge medicine, a metallic miracle born of hope, fear, and complete misunderstanding of chemistry. If you were rich, you took it proudly. If you were poor, you envied those who could. Either way, you ended up in the same place, shaking, sick, and closer to death with every drop. If you think modern detox trends are strange, just wait until you're lying on a wooden bench while your village healer prepares a medieval enema kit. And by kit, we mean a long metal syringe, a sheep's bladder, and a questionable sense of hygiene. In the Middle Ages, cleansing the body wasn't just about what went in, it was about what came out. And nothing symbolized that better than the glorious tradition of enemas, administered regularly, enthusiastically, and often in public. Enemas were a cornerstone of medieval treatment. The idea was simple. If you were sick, it meant something inside was rotten. The cure? Flush it out. Water, herbal infusions, wine, vinegar, sometimes even milk, were pumped into the rectum using a tube and bulb system. And if your healer was extra fancy, the mixture might include honey, salt, or crushed herbs. There was even an enema calendar in some regions. Different days were considered more or less spiritually optimal for purging one's guts. The process was undignified, invasive, and profoundly unpleasant. You'd be instructed to kneel or lie sideways, clench your teeth, and bear down while the healer did their work. Privacy was minimal. Dignity was optional. Results were immediate. It was like resetting your body the hard way, and if your problem was in the head rather than the gut, no worries, they had a treatment for that too. Enter the medieval ear candle, a hollow wax tube placed in the ear and lit on the opposite end. The rising heat was supposed to draw out bad spirits, excess wax, and unwanted humors. What it actually did was burn wax down toward your ear canal and potentially ignite your hair. But in a world where head pressure was blamed on brain fog demons or soul heat, it made perfect sense. Together, enemas and ear candles represented the medieval obsession with physical purging. If you were unwell, something inside you had to be expelled through sweat, vomit, blood, or other less discussed bodily exits. The body was a vessel, and health meant keeping it clean, which, in medieval terms, often meant flooding it from the bottom or setting it on fire from the top. Your healer takes one look at your pallid skin, your bloated belly, and your sluggish movements, and makes a snap judgment. You're full of filth. Not just physically, spiritually, emotionally, humorally. And there's only one solution for that in medieval medicine. Purge. Get it out. All of it. One way or another. Purgation was not a last resort. It was step one. The cornerstone of most treatments involved making your body surrender its contents, violently if necessary. Vomiting, sweating, crying, urinating, bleeding, defecating. If something could come out of you, it was considered therapeutic. If it didn't come out on its own, your healer would make sure it did. For vomiting, you might be given a cup of warm water mixed with salt, vinegar, or crushed herbs like hellebore or ipecac. Some remedies included soot, bile, or powdered metals like antimony. It would burn going down and explode coming up. But that was the goal. Empty the stomach, clear the soul. If you vomited so hard you cried or fainted, even better. That meant the treatment had penetrated. For lower body issues, purgatives came into play. These were herbal laxatives brewed from things like senna, castor oil, or dried figs, and often mixed with honey to mask the taste. The effect? Explosive. You wouldn't just be clearing your bowels, you'd be cleansing your entire will to live. Cramps, dehydration, and hours in a field or chamber pot were considered minor side effects compared to the triumph of removing whatever was festering inside you. Then there were sudorifics, sweat-inducing tonics and ointments meant to make you perspire until your sheets were soaked and your fever broke. Sometimes you were wrapped in wool and placed by a fire, your face flushed, eyes wild, heart racing. The body was supposed to steam out the illness. If you hallucinated from the heat, that wasn't cause for concern. That was a sign your soul was stirring. The logic behind all of this was based on balance. Too much of any one humor, blood, phlegm, yellow or black bile, meant your system was overloaded. And the cure was simple. Remove whatever was in excess, by force if needed. People didn't just expect discomfort during treatment. They demanded it, because comfort was for the dying. Pain? That was proof the cure was working. Now, not all healers wore robes or wielded saws. Many were women, midwives, herbalists, and wise women who had spent their lives learning how to soothe fevers, ease births, and mend bones using knowledge passed down from generations. These women knew the woods. They knew which roots to pull, what herbs to crush, how to read symptoms not just in the body, but in the voice, the eyes, the dreams. In many villages, they were the only help you could trust, and for that, they were feared. In a patriarchal world where most authority came from the church or the Lord's manor, women who practiced healing were dangerous. Their power came not from books or sanctioned institutions, but from results. and when their results threatened the fragile egos of male physicians or challenged the authority of clergy, they were called something else: witches. A woman who healed with herbs could be praised until her patient died. Then she was accused. A midwife who delivered healthy babies was revered until one infant was stillborn. Then she was cursed. The same hands that helped mothers through childbirth might be bound at the wrist and dragged through the town square. Trials were held, not to determine guilt, but to showcase control. Evidence: a wart, a pet cat, a bad harvest. Even too much knowledge of plants could be interpreted as a pact with the devil. Torture was routine. Confessions were extracted with thumbscrews and branding irons. Some women admitted to flying on broomsticks, sleeping with demons, or poisoning livestock, all under unimaginable pressure. And yet, the irony was bitter. These women were often better healers than the sanctioned doctors. They used clean cloth, they bathed, they boiled their tools. They trusted their senses instead of astrology. But reason couldn't protect them. As fear of plague, famine, and divine wrath spread, the scapegoats multiplied. Women healers were easy targets, visible, vocal, and often respected in their communities. That respect turned to suspicion in a heartbeat, and many were burned for the sin of knowledge. So when your grandmother whispered that she learned how to stop a fever with nettle tea and honey, she didn't write it down, she memorized it, passed it down, because writing made it real. And in the wrong hands, real meant ruin. In the Middle Ages, healing was heresy if done by the wrong person, and a woman with wisdom was always one illness away from the stake. It starts with a dull ache. Maybe it throbs when you chew, or when cold wind hits your cheek. But soon, the pain is constant, pulsing, radiating through your jaw like a tiny hammer inside your skull. You have a toothache. And in the Middle Ages, that's not a minor inconvenience. It's a living nightmare with no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, and no pity. Tooth decay was common. There was no concept of brushing, no toothpaste, no dental hygiene beyond occasionally rinsing with wine or chewing on herbs. Bread was coarse, often filled with grit or sawdust to stretch out the flour. That meant you weren't just grinding food. You were grinding your enamel into oblivion. Over time, cavities formed, infections settled in, and one day you woke up to find your entire mouth screaming. The healer's solution? Removal. Not a root canal, not a filling. Extraction, raw and brutal. The tools: iron pliers, a chisel, or in some cases, a sharpened stick and brute force. The method: hold still while the tooth drawer grips the offending molar and yanks it out. No numbing agent, no antibiotics, just muscle, prayer, and the sound of cracking bone echoing through your skull. If the tooth shattered, too bad. They'd dig in to retrieve the pieces, or just leave them to fester. And infections? Oh, they came. Abscesses formed, swelling your face until your eye couldn't open. Pus leaked from your gums. The pain radiated down your neck and into your spine. And if it reached your bloodstream, that was the end. A simple cavity could lead to sepsis and kill you slowly, painfully. Some people died of dental infections without ever knowing what hit them. Others begged for the tooth to be removed no matter the cost. The wealthy might have access to traveling tooth pullers, charlatans with more flair than skill who worked crowds at fairs, yanking teeth in front of cheering audiences. They wore flashy clothes, sang songs, and made jokes as they pulled molars with rusting tongs. People laughed. The patient screamed. It was a performance, a sideshow of suffering disguised as healing. And there were no replacements, no dentures. If you lost your teeth, you simply lived without them. Chewing became painful, talking awkward, smiling, rare. A clean mouth wasn't attractive, it was suspicious. Everyone had bad teeth, bad breath, swollen gums. Toothaches were just a part of life and death. If you thought a toothache was bad, wait until your dentist becomes your executioner. In the Middle Ages, dentistry wasn't a profession. It was an act of improvisational torture with unpredictable results. A single infected tooth could lead to brain swelling, jaw rot, or a blood infection that carried you from fever to funeral in less than a week. And the worst part? The treatments might speed that up. Say you had an abscessed tooth, swollen, hot to the touch, filled with pus. The healer might not remove it right away. First, they'd try to drain it by lancing the gum with a knife or hot needle. The drainage was messy, painful, and dangerous. Infections weren't cleaned properly. Blood wasn't clotting well. You could choke on the pus during sleep or develop a secondary infection in your neck. There was no concept of sterilization, and no one understood what sepsis was. You just knew your head hurt, your heart raced, and everything got blurry before the end came. If you were lucky, the tooth would be pulled. But lucky is a relative term. The extraction could break your jaw. The tools could slip. The wound could become infected within hours. There were stories of people bleeding out from their mouths, or developing tetanus after being treated with iron tools that had been left out in the rain. The healer might seal the gum with wine, salt, or, if they were bold, hot coals. It worked about as well as you'd expect. And some dental healers weren't healers at all. They were traveling frauds, snake oil salesmen with charm and zero training. They used rope, wooden mallets, and even hammers to knock teeth loose. Their motto was speed over skill. Get it out fast, collect the coin, and move on before infection set in. Your mouth might end up missing the wrong tooth, or the jawbone beneath it. You'd live the rest of your life slurring your words and avoiding hard foods. But the most terrifying outcome wasn't pain, it was death. A rotten tooth close to the sinuses or brain could lead to meningitis or brain abscess. Blood infections weren't treated, they weren't even named. You just collapsed. Fever took over. And no one blamed the healer. They blamed sin, or the devil, or maybe just fate. Medieval dentistry wasn't about fixing teeth. It was about surviving long enough to outlive them. Your eyes are red, swollen, maybe leaking something yellow and unpleasant. In the mirror, or rather, the cracked piece of polished metal that passes for one, you notice that your vision's going blurry. Today, we'd rush to an ophthalmologist. In the Middle Ages, you're about to put animal grease in your eye and hope for the best. Ocular medicine in medieval Europe was a terrifying blend of superstition, herbal guesswork, and anything that looked vaguely medicinal when smeared across a face. Eye problems were common, made worse by smoke-filled homes, soot, poor diet, and constant exposure to infection. Treatments included ointments made from goose fat, ox gall, onion juice, vinegar, or even pulverized dried lizard. Some were applied with feather tips. Others were dripped directly into the eye from a horn spoon. Painful? Constantly. Effective? Occasionally risky. Always. And then came the tools. If something was stuck in your eye, a bit of grit, an infected hair, or, God forbid, an eyelid cyst, the healer might try to extract it with tweezers carved from bone. Or they'd simply slice it open with a blade and drain it. No numbing, no precision, just a firm grip and a prayer. Cataracts? Those were treated with a horrifying method called couching, where a sharp needle was jabbed through the eye to dislodge the clouded lens. You didn't get your sight back. You got blur instead of blackness. And if the healer's hands trembled, you went blind or worse. Diseases like trachoma and conjunctivitis were blamed on everything from bad air to sinful dreams. So, along with ointments, you might be told to sleep with your head facing east, avoid cheese, or carry a relic of St. Lucy, patron of the blind. Sometimes the treatment involved bloodletting, yes, for your eyes. They'd open a vein in your temple or behind your ear to release the pressure. You'd feel lightheaded. You'd probably feel worse. But medieval eye care wasn't all horror. Some monks and herbalists developed surprisingly accurate salves using rosewater, egg whites, or cooling herbs like chamomile and fennel. These rare, gentle remedies were mixed with beeswax and stored in lead pots. Not great, but better than boiling onion juice. Still, the overall odds weren't in your favor. Eye infections often led to blindness. And in a world where survival depended on sight, that was a sentence. When your vision started to go, you didn't expect it to come back. You just hoped you'd still be able to walk without bumping into your own grave. If it hurts, it's working. That was the underlying philosophy of medieval medicine. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was embraced, invited, weaponized. Because to the minds of the time, the path to healing was supposed to be brutal. If a remedy burned, stung, or made you scream, then clearly the illness was being driven out. The worse it felt, the better it must be. This was true across every kind of treatment. Hot iron cautery to stop bleeding, that's good pain. Scraping ulcers with rough cloth soaked in vinegar. Cleansing pain, searing poultices applied to inflamed joints until the skin blistered. Productive pain. Even remedies for common colds could involve inhaling acrid smoke until your eyes teared and your throat closed. You weren't supposed to feel relief. You were supposed to suffer through the fire until your sickness gave up and left your body in defeat. Pain was also a form of penance. Many healers, especially those aligned with the church, believed that suffering had spiritual value. If your treatments were painful, it meant your soul was being purified. If you cried out during a procedure, it wasn't just a medical reaction, it was a moral purge. The wound wasn't just on your skin, it was on your soul, and every scream helped scrape it clean. Some treatments seemed intentionally cruel. Skin diseases were treated by flaying the surface, scraping it raw, then dousing it with salt or acidic wine. Open wounds were stuffed with cobwebs or stale bread crusts. Abrasive, often filthy, and always excruciating. Blisters were burned off. Warts were sliced away. Broken bones were yanked into place by raw force. Even childbirth, already a trial of agony, came with additional painful blessings, like midwives inserting hands or hot compresses without care for gentleness. Because pain meant life. Pain meant the body was still fighting. And if you didn't feel pain, that was worse. That meant the body had stopped responding. That meant death was close. There was no concept of pain management. No goal to minimize suffering. The more you writhed, the more your healer nodded in approval. And if you begged them to stop, they'd remind you that healing was a test, and you were being graded with fire. You shuffle into the healer's hut, clutching your side, pale, feverish, and barely able to stand. The first thing they ask for? A jug of your urine. And not because they're trying to run a chemical test. They're going to look at it, smell it, taste it, and sometimes listen to it being poured. In medieval medicine, your pee was a crystal ball, a diagnostic miracle, and strangely, a beverage of expertise. Uroscopy, the study of urine for diagnosis, was a widely accepted practice. Physicians carried color charts to match against the sample, each shade representing a different imbalance of humors. Pale yellow meant phlegmatic. Deep red, too much blood. Brown or blackish, Trouble? Green? You probably didn't have long. They swirled it in glass flasks, sniffed it for rot, and sometimes held it to candlelight to check for cloudiness or floating particles. Every bubble, streak, and smell was considered significant. And yes, there were some who tasted it. Just a dab on the tongue. Salty, sweet, metallic. The flavor might tell your healer if you had a fever, liver disease, or something more mysterious. Some records even describe physicians who judged the thickness of urine on the lips. That's not medicine, that's commitment or madness. Pee wasn't just diagnostic, it was symbolic. In monasteries, urine was collected and preserved as a record of health. Some healers believed it reflected not just the body, but the soul. There were rituals to collect it at sunrise, when it was purest, and containers were carefully chosen, glass for the wealthy, clay for the poor. The more prestigious the bottle, the more trustworthy the diagnosis. And don't expect privacy. Uroscopy was often performed in public consultations. You'd hand over your flask while your symptoms were loudly discussed in front of family and curious neighbors. If your pee smelled like rot, people stepped back. If it came out black, someone might start measuring you for a coffin. Yet, for all its theatrics, this method sometimes worked, just by accident. Diabetic urine did taste sweet. Liver failure could discolor urine. Infection might cloud it. But medieval medicine didn't understand the reasons. They just believed that your body leaked secrets, and nothing spilled more clearly than what flowed into a pot first thing in the morning. You wake up and there it is, a swelling, hot to the touch, throbbing with pressure. By nightfall, it bursts, erupting with pus that oozes down your skin. In the modern world, you'd call a doctor. In the medieval world, people called it a blessing. That's right. Pustules, boils, and abscesses weren't always feared. Sometimes they were celebrated, because in the age of humors and holy signs, pus meant your body was fighting back. Medieval physicians believed that the appearance of pus was part of the natural healing process. In fact, they coined a term for it, laudable pus. It was considered a good thing, visual proof that the body was drawing out the illness. A wound that wept was a wound that worked. If an incision became inflamed and erupted with white or yellow discharge, doctors would nod in satisfaction. It matures nicely, they'd say, as if it were cheese. But if the wound stayed dry, that was bad. Dryness meant death. Healers would even try to encourage pus formation by packing wounds with damp moss, bread mold, or rotting meat to draw out the poison. This was done with the belief that nature would expel all sickness through discharge, pain, swelling, fever. That meant the illness was leaving. Your screams? Merely background music for progress. It didn't stop at surgical wounds. Pustules on the skin, especially during the plague, were seen as markers of survival if they drained. People would lance them with unwashed knives, let the fluid drip into a cloth, then burn the cloth to destroy the evil. Some families collected the pus-soaked rags in jars to offer at shrines in gratitude. Boils weren't just a medical condition, they were spiritual events. The risk of infection, of course, was astronomical. You were more likely to get gangrene than glory. Yet the culture of pain as proof was so deeply rooted that festering became part of the plan. Healers feared wounds that healed too fast. They wanted the long, gory, oozing road to recovery. The ideal patient bled, swelled, drained, and lived barely. So if you had boils in the Middle Ages, you didn't cover them up, you showed them, you pointed and hoped they burst soon. Because if they didn't, it wasn't the pus you needed to worry about. It was what came next. You're lying on a wooden bench, pale and sweating, as your healer sharpens a blade. You assume he's about to cut. But instead, he reaches for something far more mysterious: a star chart. Because in the Middle Ages, timing a medical procedure didn't just depend on symptoms, it depended on the sky. Welcome to the celestial operating table, where your arteries answer to Aries, and bloodletting is postponed if Saturn's in the wrong house. Medieval doctors believed that every part of the body was ruled by a zodiac sign. The head, Aries; the neck, Taurus; the chest, Cancer; the legs, Pisces. And just like tides or harvests, your bodily functions were thought to rise and fall with the moon and stars. A misaligned moon could mean disastrous results. A Venus retrograde might ruin a wound. And so, physicians refused to bleed, purge, or even examine certain areas of the body unless the stars approved. Astrological tables, called ephemerides, were as essential as scalpels. Healers carried them everywhere, consulting lunar positions and planetary alignments before making a single cut. Some procedures were only allowed during waxing moons. Others required Jupiter's blessing. Birth dates, times of injury, and even the patient's dominant humor were mapped onto cosmic charts, creating a constellation of confusion that somehow led to treatment. Bloodletting, especially, was dictated by astrology. The sign ruling the part of the body being treated had to not be in ascendancy, or else the bleeding could go too deep, or the wound might resist closure. So, if you needed a vein opened in your leg, and Pisces was rising, too bad. Come back next week, unless you die first. The belief went beyond surgery. Emotional states, fevers, sleep disorders, even rashes were linked to planetary misbehavior. Mars was blamed for inflammation. Saturn brought melancholy. Mercury caused twitching. And the sun? Well, it could burn away sin or cause plague, depending on who you asked. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was mainstream medicine. Universities taught it. Physicians published volumes linking the stars to the body's functions. Treatises with names like De Astronomia Medica were consulted like holy texts. There was no separating medicine from the cosmos. Your body was a universe, and any disturbance in the heavens could wreck your insides. So if your surgery was delayed, it wasn't laziness. It was astrology. Your life dangled not just by a thread, but by the tail of a comet you never saw coming. In a world ruled by faith, even medicine had to kneel. And while medieval doctors looked to the stars and poked around in pus, they also had to navigate a much more dangerous force: the church. Because healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. And if your treatments didn't align with Scripture, you were a heretic, not a healer. The church had enormous influence over medical theory. It endorsed Galen, the ancient Roman whose ideas about humors and anatomy were considered gospel. Dissecting a body to learn something new. Sinful. Reading ancient pagan texts without church oversight. Forbidden. Even suggesting that disease might have a natural cause, not divine punishment, could land you in front of an inquisitor. Monasteries were centers of healing, but they operated under spiritual law. Illness was the result of sin. Recovery came from prayer, not probing. Monks copied ancient texts, but they edited them to fit Christian doctrine. Anatomy books left out reproductive systems. Surgical guides omitted anything immodest. And treatments were tailored to spiritual health as much as physical. Fasting, confession, pilgrimages. A sick soul made a sick body, and no herbal poultice could compete with a well-timed prayer. Physicians who strayed too far into experimentation risked more than ridicule. They risked excommunication, or worse. Dissections were banned in many places. Surgeons were seen as lower-class laborers. Innovators were often silenced. The safest path was obedience. Repeat what Galen wrote. treat with respect to Scripture. Never suggest that God's plan could be measured with a blade. But under the surface, change simmered. Arab scholars translated lost Greek works, expanding the medical world with insights from places like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. Their writings, smuggled into Europe, brought whispers of a more rational medicine. Some brave physicians began questioning the old texts, dissecting in secret, and testing instead of trusting. Still, the church loomed. Every cure had to pass the test of doctrine. Every textbook bore the stain of spiritual compromise. Progress came slowly, wrapped in prayers and shadowed by fear. In the Middle Ages, being a healer meant walking a tightrope between science and salvation. And if you slipped, the fall wasn't into ignorance, it was into the fire. Forget bright lecture halls and sterile labs. If you wanted to study medicine in the Middle Ages, you didn't walk into a hospital. You walked into a battlefield, a butcher's shop, or, if you were lucky, a monastery with a good library and a tolerance for gore. Because medieval medical education was a wild mix of second-hand texts, battlefield improvisation, and watching people die in vivid detail. Welcome to the school of saw and smoke. Formal medical schools did exist: Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna. These were the elite institutions where wealthy young men could read Latin translations of Galen, Aristotle, and Hippocrates under the supervision of aging scholars who rarely touched a sick person. They memorized theory, debated humors, and studied star charts more than surgical techniques. In many places, students weren't even allowed to touch the body. Dissection was frowned upon or banned outright. Anatomy came from ancient diagrams, not from corpses. So how did anyone actually learn to treat injuries? Simple. They didn't, until necessity forced it. Real surgical knowledge came from the fringes: barber surgeons, battlefield medics, and traveling healers who learned through blood and fire. You watched someone crack a skull open during war. You tried to close a wound on a soldier who wouldn't stop screaming. You learned quickly, or your patient died. Apprenticeship was brutal. You carried tools, held limbs down, cleaned up vomit, and fetched boiling water. If you were lucky, you got to pull a tooth or apply a poultice by your 3rd year. If not, you swept floors while your master sawed off legs. And there was no clear distinction between medicine and butchery. A good surgeon was often also a good butcher, someone who knew how to cut through muscle and bone with speed and precision. Textbooks were copied by hand, often wrong, and full of contradictions. You might read that a fever was caused by too much blood, but another text says it's not enough. You learn to bleed patients on certain days, to avoid treating left-handed people under mercury, to keep your tools near the fire for warmth, not sanitation. Clean hands were rare, knowledge was fragmented, and your first successful surgery might be the first time your patient didn't die on the table. Medical school in the Middle Ages wasn't about understanding the body. It was about surviving your mistakes long enough to call yourself a doctor. The curtain is pulled. The crowd leans forward. On the stone slab lies a body, naked, cold, and ready to be opened. The audience: students, priests, nobles, curious villagers, and the occasional drunk who just wanted a free show. Welcome to the spectacle of medieval public dissection, where death became a classroom and the human body was unwrapped like a forbidden gift. These dissections were rare and tightly controlled, usually sanctioned by the church and carried out only under strict conditions, like using the corpse of a criminal, preferably one who'd been hanged for something sensational. It wasn't about medicine, it was about morality. The body on the table was a warning as much as a lesson. Sin leads to punishment, punishment leads to death, and death leads to dissection. The dissector, often a university professor or high-ranking physician, rarely did the cutting himself. That job fell to a lower-ranking assistant who performed the messy work while the master stood beside him with a pointer and a lecture scroll, describing organs from memory as if he were reading a map instead of watching a body spill open. Students scribbled notes. Spectators gasped. And the smell? Absolutely unbearable. There was no refrigeration, no preservative, just rotting flesh under the hot breath of 100 onlookers. Organs were identified, but not always understood. The liver was the seat of emotions. The heart, a furnace of heat. The brain, a cooling sponge. No one knew about blood circulation. The intestines were poked and prodded like exotic snakes. Every discovery was filtered through the lens of ancient theory and Catholic doctrine. Anything that contradicted Galen was quietly ignored. After all, the dead couldn't argue back, but the church could. Dissections became public events, sometimes announced in town squares. Attending one was both educational and voyeuristic. People came to learn, but also to marvel at the macabre. Children watched. Nobles fainted. Jokes were made. It was anatomy and theater combined, morbid entertainment under the banner of science. And yet, despite all the ceremony and superstition, these grim lessons pushed medicine forward, slowly, painfully, but forward nonetheless. Each slice into human flesh revealed what textbooks couldn't, and while most walked away queasy or stunned, a few left enlightened, ready to treat the living a little better because they'd seen the secrets of the dead. You're sick, getting worse, and the local healer has done all he can, which, to be clear, wasn't much. The herbs didn't work. The bleeding made you weaker. And that weird-smelling ointment has attracted more flies than relief. There's only one path left now: divine intervention. In the Middle Ages, healing wasn't just medical, it was miraculous. So you pack your few belongings and make the journey to the nearest shrine, because your hope now rests with saints and sacred bones. Miracle healing was woven into medieval medicine like thread through a tapestry. When human hands failed, people turned to the supernatural. Saints were believed to possess healing power in death, especially those who had suffered nobly or died horribly. Their remains, or even items they had touched, were preserved as relics: bones, teeth, scraps of clothing, pieces of wood, even dried blood. People believed these objects could heal everything from blindness to plague, if only you touch them with the right amount of faith. And a coin for the offering box. Shrines were scattered across Europe, often in grand cathedrals, glowing with candlelight and heavy with the scent of incense. Pilgrims would travel for days, even weeks, to reach them. Some crawled on their knees. Others carried sick children, or came barefoot, weeping with every step. The most famous shrines, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Cologne in Germany, drew crowds year-round, all begging for divine mercy. The rituals were intense. You might drink water that had touched a saint's bone, or touch the bone directly, laid out in a golden reliquary shaped like an arm, a foot, or sometimes a whole human figure encrusted in gems. Some believers slept beside the relic overnight, hoping for healing dreams. Others lit candles and recited prayers non-stop, their voices trembling with fever. If you walked away feeling better, a miracle. If you didn't, you were told to pray harder. And sometimes people did feel better. Was it the placebo effect, the power of belief, a real recovery misattributed to the divine? It didn't matter. In a world where real medicine often hurt more than helped, a quiet moment in a holy place, surrounded by reverence and ritual, felt like healing in itself. So you knelt, You cried. You touched the glass that covered the relic and whispered your prayer. Because in the Middle Ages, saints weren't symbols. They were surgeons of the soul, and sometimes, just sometimes, of the body. When your village has run out of ideas, your healer shrugs, and even the relics haven't answered your prayers, there's only one path left. Walk. Pack your bag. Say goodbye. You're going on a pilgrimage, not just for spiritual redemption, but for your health. In the Middle Ages, sometimes healing meant movement. And the longer, harder, and more painful the journey, the better your chances, according to belief. Pilgrimage was the medieval answer to everything. Illness, guilt, grief, fear of hell, it could all be washed away if you walked far enough to a sacred site. And while some sought healing for their souls, others sought healing for their bodies. The Church encouraged this. Travel purified you. Endurance showed devotion. If your legs were strong enough to take you to a holy place, perhaps God would be merciful enough to fix the rest of you. But these journeys were brutal. There were no buses or inns with fresh towels. Pilgrims walked in all seasons, through mud, rain, snow, and sun, wearing threadbare clothes and carrying only the barest provisions. Some joined groups for safety, others wandered alone. Along the way you might sleep in stables, under trees, or in hastily built hospices run by monks. Disease was rampant. So was robbery, and yet they came, by the hundreds, by the thousands. The most faithful pilgrims went barefoot. Some wore iron chains. Some whipped themselves with leather cords as they walked. The pain was part of the point. It wasn't just about arrival. It was about suffering along the way. Every blister, every sore, every hunger pang was considered a spiritual tax paid in advance for healing. And what awaited them at the end? A church, a relic, a pool said to be blessed by saints. Sometimes even the dirt or water near the shrine was believed to hold curative power. You might bathe in it, smear it on your skin, or take a vial home to someone too sick to travel. Some pilgrims left behind crutches and splints, proof of healing. Others left tokens, carvings, or written pleas. Not all were healed, many died en route, but even that was seen as holy. To perish on pilgrimage was a fast track to salvation. For those who returned, the journey was etched into their body. Feet swollen, skin weathered, faith deepened. Whether or not they were cured, they were transformed. Because in the Middle Ages, to heal wasn't just to survive. It was to prove to God that you were worth saving. Someone sneezes down the road, another coughs and collapses in the marketplace. Within days, the whispers begin, there's sickness in town. And just like that, your life becomes a game of survival, one where isolation isn't just suggested, it's enforced with boards, bells, and fear. Welcome to quarantine medieval style, where your symptoms don't just lock you in, they lock the world out. In an age where nobody understood germs but everybody feared death, quarantine was one of the few public health measures that actually worked, sort of. The idea wasn't new. As early as the 12th century, some port cities like Venice began isolating incoming ships suspected of carrying disease. They called it 40 giorni, 40 days, which became the basis of the word quarantine. But outside major cities, it was less about science and more about superstition, survival, and social panic. If you showed signs of plague, leprosy, or another dreaded illness, the first response wasn't a doctor, it was distance. Officials marked your house with chalk, hung signs, or nailed wooden planks across the door. You were sealed in, sometimes with your whole family, left to rot or recover. In extreme cases, guards patrolled the perimeter to make sure no one left. It wasn't rare for towns to wall off entire neighborhoods or torch infected houses to the ground. If you could walk, you might be ordered to a pest house, a grim, overcrowded isolation building on the edge of town where the sick went to vanish. These were filled with the dying and staffed by the desperate. Airless, filthy, and constantly filled with moaning, the pest house was more morgue than hospital. Food, if provided, was slid through cracks or delivered by carts pulled by men in bird-like plague masks. The infected weren't the only ones quarantined. Suspected contacts were told to self-isolate, if they had homes. Travelers, beggars, and even physicians returning from pest-ridden towns were made to camp outside city walls, burning their clothes and bedding before being allowed back in. And if someone died inside a quarantined house, their body was sometimes removed at night and buried in mass graves without ceremony. To be isolated in the Middle Ages wasn't just a public safety measure. It was a living death sentence. Your neighbors avoided your home like it was cursed. You weren't visited. You weren't helped. You were forgotten. But somehow, this crude method sometimes worked. The infection slowed, towns survived. And when it ended, if it ended, you emerged into sunlight blinking, hungry, changed. Because in medieval quarantine, you didn't just lose time, you lost the sense that anyone would come save you. You start talking to yourself. You forget your name. You cry for no reason. You see things no one else can. Today, we might call it schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, or trauma. But in the Middle Ages, it was something far more dangerous. Madness, or worse, possession. Because back then, mental illness wasn't treated. It was judged, feared, and punished. To medieval minds, the brain wasn't a complex organ. It was a vessel for spirits. Good ones if you were pious. Evil ones if you weren't. If you heard voices, they weren't chemical misfires. They were demons whispering in your ear. If you sobbed for days, it wasn't emotional distress. It was divine punishment. And if you lashed out, you were either cursed, damned, or a witch in training. Families dealt with mentally ill relatives in secrecy and shame. If you were lucky, they kept you home, locked in a room, fed under a door. If not, you were abandoned, left at a monastery, a hospital, or on the steps of a church where monks or nuns might take you in. But treatment wasn't gentle. Chains were common. So were ice baths, flogging, fasting, and prayer vigils that lasted days. The goal wasn't understanding. It was obedience. Church authorities saw madness as a spiritual imbalance. Confession was mandatory. Exorcism was frequent. You might be forced to wear a cross around your neck, chant psalms until your throat bled, or be doused in holy water while priests shouted Latin and slammed the Bible on your head. And if your symptoms returned, clearly your soul wasn't trying hard enough. Physicians had their own theories, of course. Imbalanced humors again, especially black bile. Too much of it caused melancholy, too little, mania. Treatments ranged from herbal teas and bloodletting to more stimulating methods like induced vomiting or surprise beatings. And women? If you were too sad, angry, or independent, it wasn't illness. It was hysteria, caused, obviously, by your wandering womb. Despite this darkness, there were rare lights. Some monasteries kept gardens for the insane, offering quiet spaces and calm routines. Some healers truly believed in kindness and rest, but these were the exception. Most of the time, mental illness in the Middle Ages was a one-way path to fear and isolation. You weren't just sick, you were other. A threat, a warning, a soul in need of saving, even if it broke your body to do it. Your leg wound is infected, it's turning black, it smells like rot. The healer throws up his hands. He's out of prayers, out of leeches, out of poultices. But then he notices something strange. The wound is crawling. with maggots. And instead of recoiling in horror, he leans in, squints, and murmurs, "Leave them?" In a world full of brutal treatments and guesswork, maggots, yes, maggots, were one of the few things that actually worked. Without knowing why, some medieval healers began noticing that wounds infested with certain fly larvae didn't just survive, they healed. The maggots ate the dead flesh and left the healthy tissue untouched. They prevented infection. They sped up recovery. They didn't look like medicine, but they were. This wasn't a widespread or celebrated discovery. It wasn't formalized in textbooks. It was something healers stumbled across, often in desperation, on battlefields, in swamps, and in peasant villages far from noble scrutiny. They'd open a bandage expecting pus and found wriggling life instead. And they began to notice. These wounds didn't smell as bad. They didn't swell as much. They closed. Most of the time, though, people saw maggots as signs of decay, filth, death, the worst possible omen. Families demanded they be removed. Healers complied, even when it made things worse. But in hushed corners of certain monasteries and army tents, some learned to let the maggots stay. Not forever. Just long enough to do their work. No antiseptics, no antibiotics, no concept of microbes. But somehow, this tiny creature, reviled and feared, was saving lives centuries before penicillin. All it took was a little patience, and a lot of courage to ignore the horror on your patient's face. Of course, once the maggots had done their job, the wound still had to be cleaned, bandaged, and watched closely. Some healers used honey or wine to finish the treatment. Others prayed the infection wouldn't return. But they all shared a strange, uncomfortable truth. Sometimes salvation came on 6 wriggling legs, burrowing into your skin with silent precision. Your fever won't break. Your skin's covered in rashes. The healer steps inside with a live frog and a serious face. He's not joking. You're about to be treated by animal. Because in the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't just made from animals. It sometimes was the animal. Cats, dogs, pigeons, snakes, toads, each with its own bizarre role in the healing arsenal. Let's start with the frogs. For sore throats, a live frog might be placed in your mouth, under your tongue until it stopped croaking, taking the illness with it supposedly. For fevers, tie the frog to your foot. For boils, slice it open and smear the insides directly on the skin. Unsanitary. Absolutely. But when your options are frog guts or a hot iron, suddenly Kermit seems kind of merciful. Pigeons were next in line. If someone had a seizure or plague symptoms, you might split a pigeon in half and slap the warm, open body onto their feet or chest. The logic? The animal would draw out the illness. Did it work? Not really. But people claimed miracles when a pigeon flapped its last breath during a fever spike. Mice were boiled into poultices. Snakes were dried, ground, and added to wine. Spiders were crushed and mixed with butter for infected bites. And dogs? Sometimes people just believed sleeping with one would protect you from bad dreams and sudden death. Some wore animal teeth or bones as charms. Others carried dried toads in pouches sewn into their clothes. The animal didn't have to be alive, just potent. And let's not forget bezoars, calcified lumps taken from animal stomachs, especially goats. These were prized as universal antidotes. Swallow one, and you were supposedly immune to poison. Royal courts kept them on hand like magical life insurance. To us, these treatments sound absurd, but to medieval minds, animals were closer to nature, and nature was full of divine power. Their instincts, organs, and sufferings were believed to align with human ailments. They were seen as bridges between the human and the healing world, and sometimes that bridge was wrapped in feathers or stuffed into a leather pouch. So, if you had a medieval pet, it wasn't just for companionship. It might be the only thing standing between you and the grave. You're weak, infected, and on the verge of collapse. A kind neighbor helps you to the town hospital. But don't get your hopes up. In the Middle Ages, hospital didn't mean sterile wards and nurses in white. It meant a crowded stone hall, groaning patients packed on straw, and a quiet acceptance that most people inside would never walk out again. Medieval hospitals were often run by monasteries and religious orders. Their purpose wasn't to cure you. It was to provide a place to die with dignity, preferably facing a crucifix, with your sins freshly confessed. You weren't admitted because you had a chance of recovery. You were admitted because your family couldn't care for you anymore, and neither could anyone else. These hospitals were more spiritual than medical. Beds were lined side by side with little to no separation. Patients moaned, prayed, and coughed blood into shared linens. The air was thick with incense and illness. Monks and nuns offered prayers, not prescriptions. Meals were sparse: porridge, stale bread, maybe some watered wine. Treatment consisted of herbal salves, whispered psalms, and last rites performed twice a day just in case you didn't make it to the evening bell. There were no surgical theaters, no trained nurses. At best, you were wrapped in a clean cloth and given a moment of peace. At worst, you were forgotten in a corner, your body barely distinguishable from the next one over. Sanitation was non-existent. Blood, vomit, urine, and pus soaked into the straw and festered. Vermin roamed freely: mice under the beds, fleas in the blankets, lice in your hair. Infection spread faster than faith could stop it. Despite all this, people still came. Because the hospital offered what homes often couldn't: shelter, warmth, a roof, and maybe, just maybe, a miracle. Some institutions, particularly those in large cities or near holy relics, offered better care. Their monks had more medical training. Their gardens grew medicinal herbs. Their records were meticulous. But they were the exception. For most, the hospital wasn't a second chance. It was a final destination. You didn't go to a medieval hospital to heal. You went to prepare. For death. For judgment. For the slow extinguishing of breath in a room full of ghosts still clinging to their last scraps of hope. While peasants lay in overcrowded pest houses and prayed for someone to change their bandages, the rich were being treated in sunlit chambers by private physicians who charged more gold than some villagers saw in a lifetime. In the Middle Ages, healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about money. And if you had enough of it, you got the good kind of suffering. Nobles and royalty didn't rely on wandering barbers or back-alley apothecaries. They hired personal doctors, men trained in the best universities of the day, fluent in Latin, armed with books bound in calfskin, and always dressed well enough to be mistaken for clergy. These physicians didn't perform surgery. That was still beneath them. But they advised, oversaw treatments, and most importantly, knew how to flatter their patrons while bleeding them both literally and financially. For the elite, sickness was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Their linens were changed, their rooms were aired, their broths were warm and prepared by cooks, not handed down from a communal pot. They had access to the rarest herbs, the finest instruments, and, most importantly, time. No waiting in line, no shared straw mattresses, no crust of bread smeared with lard and wishful thinking. They could afford spices, clove, cinnamon, ginger, to soothe the stomach and mask the scent of decay. They had access to wine strong enough to numb pain and servants to hold them down when things got bloody. Some even had imported relics on loan from the church. just in case a miracle could be negotiated. And if things got really bad, they had the luxury of multiple opinions. But privilege didn't guarantee survival. Rich or poor, everyone bled the same. Infections didn't check your family crest, and when it came to diseases like plague or smallpox, the physician's robes and fancy herbs were as useless as a peasant's frog poultice. Nobles died in velvet sheets, peasants died in fields. Death didn't care about your title. Still, the rich fared better. They had more chances, more comfort, more hands to hold and wipe away sweat. Their journals record long, elegant suffering. Their tombs were grand, their deaths poetic. Meanwhile, the poor were buried in pits with no names and no last words. In the end, medicine in the Middle Ages reflected the world that shaped it. Hierarchical, cruel, and deeply unfair. The privileged didn't live forever, but they died slower, softer, and with fewer rats in the room. If you're expecting your medieval doctor to have a reliable treatment plan, think again. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't built on consistent outcomes. It was built on hope, tradition, and the bold confidence of men who guessed with knives in their hands. Every cure was a gamble, every patient a test subject, and every success a fluke polished into dogma. Welcome to trial and, mostly, error. Treatments were rarely standardized. One healer's go-to remedy might be a leech and a poultice, another's a purge and a prayer. They relied on experience, anecdote, and a generous interpretation of ancient texts. If something seemed to work once, it became gospel. Never mind, the patient might have improved on their own. The method was recorded, repeated, and passed down like scripture, results optional. Even within professional circles, contradictions reigned. Galen said one thing, Avicenna said another. Local healers had their own ideas, and the average patient, caught in the middle, subjected to whatever theory held sway in that moment. You could be diagnosed with too much black bile in one town and too little in the next. Your prescription might change mid-treatment not because of new symptoms, but because Mercury entered a new house. When one cure failed, it didn't discredit the method, it discredited you. Maybe you didn't pray enough. Maybe you were secretly sinful. Or maybe you just had a weak constitution. In this world, the healer was rarely wrong. The patient simply wasn't trying hard enough to be saved. But somehow, through the chaos, bits of knowledge emerged. Healers began noticing patterns. Certain herbs helped with certain wounds. Isolation slowed plague. Boiling instruments reduced deaths. Not always understood, and never universally applied, but learned nonetheless. Every bleeding, every burnt wound, every incorrectly applied remedy was a lesson carved in pain and loss. Medieval medicine wasn't a science. It was an ongoing experiment, one where the test subjects never got to read the notes. The closest thing to peer review? A rival healer shouting contradictions in the marketplace. The only constant was this: you tried, you failed, you tried again. And the patient either thanked you or didn't live long enough to complain. The fever breaks, the swelling goes down, the color returns to your face. You're not dead. And in the Middle Ages, that's not just luck, it's a miracle. You've survived medieval medicine, and now you get to live with the aftermath. Scars, stiffness, missing teeth. Maybe a few phantom screams that echo when you sleep. But you're alive, and that's more than most can say. Your body is changed. The wound that almost took your leg still weeps on rainy days. You flinch when anyone touches your ribs. Your back aches from lying on straw for weeks, and your skin itches from the fleas that made a colony in your blanket. You've lost weight, your hair has thinned, and you haven't smiled in months. not that anyone would see it behind the bandages. You now walk with a limp, or you've lost a finger, or half your teeth are blackened stumps. But in your village, you're a legend, the one who lived. Children whisper your name. Old women shake their heads in amazement. Your healer claims credit, of course, says his mustard poultice did the trick. You let him, because arguing takes energy, and you're saving yours for the long road of slow, crooked healing. Food tastes sweeter, the sky looks brighter, but you don't trust your body anymore. Every twitch, every ache feels like a relapse. You sleep with one eye open and herbs tucked under your pillow. You still smell smoke, still hear prayers muttered in Latin, still feel phantom pain in a limb that's no longer there. Recovery in the Middle Ages isn't clean. It isn't quiet. It's an uphill crawl through mud and memory. And just when you think you've finally left it behind, you wake up coughing again. A chill in your spine, a tightness in your chest. And your first thought isn't, what is it? It's, who will help this time? Because you know the answer. The man with the blade, the prayer, the leech. You survived. But you're still in the Middle Ages. And survival is just the first round. You made it through the boils, the blades, the boiling oil, and the bleeding. Now, centuries later, we look back in disbelief. How did anyone survive medieval medicine? And yet they did. Enough to build towns, raise empires, write stories, and eventually crawl into something resembling science. Because buried under all the blood and superstition was the raw beginning of modern medicine. Desperate, blind, and astonishingly human. The legacy of medieval medicine isn't just found in dusty manuscripts or museum tools, it's in the lingering fear of doctors. The stories of grandmothers who still put onions on feet. The ancient belief that if it hurts, it must be helping. We laugh at the past because it seems so absurd, but truthfully, it's a mirror. One that reflects how little we once knew and how much we feared the unknown. Every leech, every lancet, every moon phase surgery was a guess. A stab in the dark, sometimes literally. And yet, out of this chaos came progress. Midwives, though persecuted, became pioneers of women's health. Herbalists passed down knowledge that still holds true today. Even the barbers, in their blood-stained aprons, laid the groundwork for surgery by actually touching the human body when no one else would. Trial became habit. Habit became theory. Theory eventually became practice. And those who suffered, who bled, boiled, and burned, gave us the hard-earned lessons written in bone and memory. Not every cure was noble. Not every healer was good. But each mistake brought us closer to truth. That is the twisted legacy. Centuries of pain turned into pages of progress. So the next time you pop an ibuprofen, sit in a waiting room, or get antibiotics for a sore throat, remember, you're living in the miracle that came after the madness. A world made slightly less fatal by those who came before. Their pain is your inheritance, their survival, your safety net. You sleep in a clean bed. Your home has plumbing. If you get sick, you call a doctor. You get treatment based on centuries of trial, error, and evolution, none of which involved tying a frog to your foot. That comfort, that safety, it wasn't given, it was earned, through pain, through blood, through countless lives that didn't have your luck. And maybe, tonight, you'll feel just a little more grateful. We romanticize the Middle Ages, the castles, the knights, the dragons that never were. But medicine strips away the fantasy and shows us the truth. It was hard, dirty, merciless. You were more likely to die from a bad tooth than a battle, more likely to be bled than healed. And yet, people lived, loved, endured, Not because the world was kind, but because humans are stubborn like that. So before you lay your head down tonight, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the nameless midwives, to the herb pickers, to the ones who boiled water before it was wise, and yes, even to the guy who thought leeches could cure everything, because in some strange, impossible way, he helped get us here. And to you, thank you for walking through this history with me, for exploring a world of pain, patience, and persistence. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love hearing from people around the world. Sharing this with you is my favorite part of what I do. This has been What a Medieval Doctor Would Do to You and Why It's Terrifying. Sleep well. Just maybe don't dream about frogs, saws, or hot pokers.